The man in Adzul's arms passed out. "Water," said Adzul, and somebody brought him a gourd. Very gently, he splashed water on the man's face, and the man's eyes fluttered open again. He, wild, his eyes were wild with fear. Adzul, in a calm voice, said, "How many men were there?" And he said, 20. They came in the late afternoon and they killed every man, woman, and child in the village. They were on horses. They thought I was dead, and when it got dark, I managed to crawl out from the bodies and escape. You've got to flee. And he passed out again. Adzul told several men to pick him up and carry him into their new house, and asked the women to go get uh, bandages and salve to treat his wounds. Uh, several men several men picked up the farmer, and one of them said, "I recognize him from the next village up the trail," and they carried him into the house. The head man of the village came to Adzul and said, "You've dealt with these men before. What do you think we should do?" And his voice was calm, but his eyes showed a lot of fear. And Adzul said, "We need to evacuate the village," he said, uh, "and flee. But we have to try to stop them as well." And the head man said, "When do you think they'll be here?" And Adzul said, "My experience is they will have gotten drunk after their rampage in the village, and they will sleep probably until midday tomorrow, and then get up and get themselves organized and come to this village. So we have tonight and tomorrow." And the headman said, "You direct the action of what we should do. You've done this before." And so Adzul said, "We need to pack up everything that we can take out of the village. If there's chicken or goose babies that the that can be carried or packed on the top of dogs, we need to take as many of them as we can. The bigger geese and animals we have to let loose out in the forest. We have to get rid of them. I want everything that can be packed and carried in the way of food and clothing packed up into packs and carried. Everything else in the village we need to bury in the gardens. Everything in the houses that we can't take with us needs to be buried. I need the men and the older boys to stay with me to fight with the conquistadors. Everyone else needs to leave and go to the hills." So, it was evening, and everybody and Adzul said, "And I need 6 women to work on a special project." So everyone set to work. And Adzul got the 6 women, and including Ita, into their new house, and he had them cut strips of cloth into almost 3-foot lengths and tie 3 strips together with a knot in the middle. And then he had the boys, the first thing he had the boys do was go out and collect fist-size rocks, slightly smaller than fist size, but roughly fist size. And he showed the women how to tie the rocks securely into the ends of the 3 strands of cloth. And what he was creating, or having them create, was a bola, a three, um, a three, what would you call, 3-strand weapon with rocks in the end of each strand that could be thrown like a helicopter blade, and it would whirl around. And the Inca people had used that to defend themselves against the conquistadors and the horses, because the horses gave an enormous advantage over fighters to men on the ground. So he had these women go to work immediately on this project. In 4 hours, everything had been taken out of the houses in the village. Now remember, it was a single street with 1-story low adobe houses on either side. Everything had been taken out of the houses and buried in the soft dirt of the gardens. Everything that could be carried, including some of the goose ducklings and chickens, had been saved. All the larger animals turned loose, taken way, way, way away from the village and turned loose. And within 4 hours, maybe 5, middle of the night, the older men and women, all the women and the younger children, all the dogs, had been packed and assembled. The older people carried light packs. The younger women carried heavier packs. The kids carried whatever they could, as much as they could carry. And Adzul went to an old trader and said, go north. He said, go north. He said, for the first, as best as you can, tonight and tomorrow, try to walk on hard ground and walk on rocks to the best of your ability, not to leave tracks. After midday tomorrow, just go as fast as you can and go north and keep going. Do not send anyone back for us. If we don't catch up with you, you'll have to go as far north as you can and make a new village. We will catch up with you sooner or later. And the old trader understood exactly what Adzul was saying, because if anyone went back and the conquistadors found them, the conquistadors would be after the people and would kill all of them. So probably about 2 a.m., the old trader, under a full moon, led the women and children and dogs and everyone except 18 men and 6 teenage boys. Adzul were left, and as they started to go, Adzul told Ida he would see her in a few days, and she said, I'm not leaving. And he said, you've got to go. We're going to be in a terrible battle with these men. She said, I'm not leaving you. We just were married this afternoon. She said, I'm not leaving you. And besides, my spears and my atlatl may be of help. And Adzul agreed. He was really happy that she didn't go with the others, because he figured if they were all killed, they'd at least die together. And so they sent the group off. And he got everybody, the men and the boys, to go to sleep. But before daylight, he was already up with the boys. Now, he took the boys first, and there were 6 boys. And he began having them practice throwing the bolas, getting the feel of it. And he told them, this is the only way we can disable the horses of the conquistadors. And if we can't disable them, they're going to kill every one of us. So I want you to practice throwing these bolas at small trees. And he outlined some trees for them. He said, I want you to try and get the bola to hit the tree and wrap around the tree, because the force of the spinning rocks would wrap the bola around the tree about 8 to 9 inches above the ground. Well, uh, Quatley, his brother-in-law, was probably the best because he had been practicing a little bit with the sling, and he had the feeling of throwing, uh, of a throwing motion. So he was probably the best, and the others began to catch on. But I mean, they practiced and practiced and practiced all morning. He set some of the men to sharpening what they had, and what they had were hoes, hatchets, and they did have some clubs, and they had a few spears and knives. And he had set some of the men sharpening them to razor sharpness. The other men he gathered, and they went outside the village and collected brush and made a sort of a V-shaped brush corridor about 4 feet high. I mean, they did a lot of work. It started at dawn, did a lot of work for about the last 100 yards coming into the village. On either side of the path coming into the village, they made this walls of brush narrowing down to the entrance into the village. Now remember, the entrance to the village is a one street with small low houses on either side. And by late morning, they had constructed a 4-foot high brush wall, and it wasn't designed to stop somebody from going through it. It was just designed to funnel the conquistadors into the village. And by late morning, the boys had become really, really good at throwing the bolas. And so he set the boys and the men in between the houses on either side of the the street. It wasn't a real narrow street, but on either side of the street going down through the houses, in between the houses. At the last, in between the last two houses, the last house on the end of the street and the next to last, on the right-hand side as you were going down the street, he put Quatley by himself. He was the best bola thrower. And then there were men with Quatley on both sides of the street, and men in between the houses, and boys with bolas in between each set of houses all the way up to the beginning of the street. And he told them the plan. And about noon, maybe a little after noon, everything was in place. Ita was on the roof of the first house to the right as the conquistadors would come into the village. She had a supply of spears and her atlatl. On the first house on the left-hand side, there was a ladder up the back of the house and a good supply of sling rocks on the top of that house for Adzul. So everybody knew what they were supposed to do, and he gave them a talk before he went out to set the trap. And he got them all together and he said, "This is a fight to the death. We will have to kill every single one of these men. Not one can escape, because if they escape, they'll go back to the main body of conquistadors wherever they are. Maybe not coming here, maybe they're still in the capital city, but they'll go back. This may have just been a patrol. They'll go back, and a large force will come and track us down through the hills and kill everyone in this village. So no one can escape." And he didn't really need to make sure that they understood that. he could see in the eyes of the men and the boys, they understood. And he outlined the plan again so everybody knew what they were supposed to do. So he goes out and finds a tree just outside, just at the far end of the funnel of brush coming into the village. And he sits down and waits. And an hour went by, and it's a hot day, and bees are buzzing around, and butterflies and birds and everything. And another half an hour went by, and he felt through the ground vibration. And he looked up the trail, and the trail wasn't straight. It kind of wound through the brush and trees, and he saw smoke, or it's not smoke, dust, cloud of dust coming up from the trail, and he felt the vibration, knew the horses were coming. So he got ready. And he waited until the horses came into view, and it was a column, 2 by 2, of 20 conquistadors, led by the captain in front, who was on a black horse, and they all had spears and swords, or lances, not spears, lances and swords. And they were talking, and they were pretty happy and everything, because they'd had great success the day before. They'd wiped out this village, and they were expecting to wipe out the village they were coming to. And Adzul waited until they were about 60 yards away. And then he ran out in the middle of the path and started his sling. And the captain immediately put up a hand and stopped the column to see what was going on. And he no sooner got his hand up and stopped the column than a rock from the sling hit him smack in the nose and smashed his nose. And blood poured down his face. And with a scream of rage, he raised his sword and spurred his horse into a dead run. But Adzul was already running away down the funnel of brush toward the village. And Adzul ran like he had never run before. And he was fast. But the horses were all coming at a dead run. And in a short distance, 2 men passed the captain, and with lances extended, started gaining rapidly on Adzul. And they were anxious to be the first one, either one of them, to kill him and maybe get some kind of a reward from the captain. And Adzul ran, and he could hear the horses, and they were gaining. And he got to the edge of the village and started down the main street, and the horses were right behind him. And I forgot to tell you, there were men in between the houses, but there were a few archers, Aztec men with bows, on the roofs of the houses. There were about 3 of them with bows, and they could see how close these riders were to Adzul. And the riders were leaning forward, stretching out their lances, and the lances were, 3 feet back, and then 2 feet back. Now, back means back from his legs. They were not going to lance him through the body. They wanted to lance him in the legs and then run over him with the horses and trample him to death. That's what they wanted to do. 3 feet, 2 feet, halfway down the length of the village, the lance blades were 2 feet from behind. As he sprinted past the last alley with Quatley, the lances were 6 inches behind his calves, and Quatley hurled his bola as absolutely as hard as he could throw it, and he caught the lead horse. The one horse was slightly ahead of the other. He caught the lead horse perfectly 10 inches above its hoofs, and the horse somersaulted so fast that the rider never had a chance. The horse somersaulted, landed on top of the rider, somersaulted over the rider, and broke the rider's back. The other horse swerved to get out of the way, only to get a bola from the other alley across the street from one of the boys, and it somersaulted, and its rider went down too. That was the signal, and the boys in between the houses, all the way up the street, threw their bolas, and the horses coming behind tumbled over the horses that had fallen in front, and the whole street emerged in chaos of horses, riders. A lot of the riders had broken legs, broken arms from this huge tumble of horses that was created in the middle of the street. The riders were scrambling to their feet, trying to get out of the way, and the Aztec men, like maniacs, charged out from the alleys with hoes and hatchets and knives and attacked them. Now, the hoes were the best because they could strike from a distance with a hoe, with the wooden handle of the hoe, and they were all razor sharp. And they attacked these conquistadors like madmen. The archers up on the roofs got close to the edge of the roofs, and whenever they had a target, they had to be careful of their own men. Whenever they had a target, they loosed arrows at the conquistadors into their neck area where there was no armor or legs, anything to disable them, and let the men on the street attack them. The boys' job was done. They stayed out of it because they didn't have weapons. They had thrown all their bolas. They stayed out of it. Adzul had veered. When the first horse went down, Adzul veered sharply away behind the last house, and he was exhausted, but he didn't stop running. He ran up behind the length of houses, up to the ladder, climbed up to the roof of the house where his rocks were stored, which was the first house coming into the village, because he and Ida were charged with preventing anybody from escaping back out to the funnel, the brush funnel. And he loaded his sling and started whirling it and ran to the edge of the roof and looked over. And there was Yoti, the man who had wanted to marry Ida, fighting with the captain, who had somehow, in spite of the nose broken, had somehow gotten turned around and started to come back out of the village on his horse. And Yoti grabbed him before the guy could swing a sword and pulled him off his horse. And the captain was no coward, and he swung his sword and cut Yoti across the chest. And it wasn't fatal. He cut him across the ribs of his chest as Yoti was backing up. And Yoti fell. And the captain raised his sword to run it through Yoti's body and kill him. And his sword was coming down when a spear thrown by Ita's Atlatl went right through him, below his armor in the back and out his stomach in the front, because he was facing away from her. And he spun around in a slow spiral and fell to the street. out of the dust and confusion, another conquistador who seemed to be unharmed rushed at Yoti and kneeled down, grabbed Yoti's hair, and with his sword was going to cut his throat when a rock from Adzul's sling hit him right above the ear and crushed his skull, and he went down. Adzul leaped off the roof, grabbed Yoti, and dragged him into the alley between the houses. Adzul had his armor shirt on under his cloth shirt, and he tore his cloth shirt into strips and wrapped Yoti's chest as best he could to stop the bleeding. And he said, "You stay put, I'll be back." And Yoti could only nod his head because he was hurting big time. And Adzul rushed back out into the street, sling going, full revolutions, but it was just about over. In 10 minutes, the villagers had overcome the entire conquistador command. Not one man was left alive. Not all the horses. Some of a few of the horses had broken legs and stuff, and they had to put them out of their misery. But not all the horses were injured, and they kind of scattered out. And as soon as they got away from all the action and everything, the horses started out in the trees and down the way, past outside of the village, grazing. I mean, they weren't close. They went 200-300 yards, but they just started grazing. So everybody was in a complete state of exhaustion from this, short as it had been, from the intense emotions of getting ready and then fighting this battle. So Adzul and some of the men went around and made sure that every conquistador was dead. And then he gathered the men and boys and took them well away from the village into the trees, into some of the shade trees. And by late afternoon, every one of them was asleep. The adrenaline, the intense emotions of this battle just wiped them out. Well, the next day they were up, and they went and got some horses grazing nearby and used them to drag dead horses well up into the hills where predators would get them. They collected all the bodies of the conquistadors, all their weapons, all their armor, and carried it with the help of horses, got it all to a nearby ravine, a gully, and then shoveled dirt all day until the ravine was completely filled to the top. Then they went back, and over the next 2 days, they started partially tearing, they got rid of the brush funnel, they got all the brush away, and they started partially dismantling or damaging the houses. They set every roof on fire, and by the end of the third day after this whole thing started, the village looked like it had been deserted for years. It looked like it had been damaged. They damaged it enough, set the roofs on fire, and swept all the evidence of the battle off the street, everything. And it looked like a deserted village, which is what Adzul intended. Because if any conquistadors ever found it, They would never know what had happened. They would just think it was abandoned. And on the morning of the fourth day after the battle, they started for the hills. And they knew where the traitor had led the people, but Adzul was amazed because the traitor had been very, very good about disguising their footprints. And it wasn't until well into the afternoon of that first day of walking that they found evidence of where he had led them. And it surprised Adzul. It took him about 5 days to catch up with them because the old traitor, once they got going, had really led them fast. And they finally caught up with him, and there was a great reunion. And Ida's parents were thrilled to see her, and a girl who could have been Ida's twin came running out of the crowd and hugged Yoti, who was recovering well from his wound, his chest wound. And they had a big reunion. 2 weeks later, the traitor led them west over a range of hills, and below them was a valley with trees and a small river and nice flat grasslands on either side of the river, a small river flowing down the length of the valley. And the traitor turned to Adzul and the head man and said, years ago, when I was trading actively, I was looking for villages to trade with on the western side of the empire. And he meant the Aztec Empire. On the western side of the empire, and I came across this valley. And I thought it would be a great place to settle. And so it was. And that is the end of the story about Adzul. If you check back in a day or two, we will begin the story of his grandson, Kuto.